Welcome to episode 4 of They Made It Out of Clay. I'm your host, Allison Worth, and this week I'm joined by someone I've known my whole life, Rabbi Andrea Goldstein, to talk about NBC comedy The Good Place. Before we start the show, this is your first and only spoiler warning. We're going to be discussing all 4 seasons of The Good Place, so if you haven't seen the show yet, press pause and come back later. I don't mind, I promise. Alright, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's do a little recap. We start off with our 4 humans: Arizona dirtbag Eleanor, ethics professor Chidi, pre-successful Florida DJ Jason, and charming socialite Tahani, who are all dead. They've all wound up in the bad place, where Michael works, but it turns out he's a little more human than demon. And then there's Janet, who's not a robot, not a girl, but is a straight-up hottie. She knows everything in the universe, which is usually pretty helpful. And over the course of the Good Place's run, this group, affectionately known as Team Cockroach, has to figure out how to save humanity, because it turns out it's very, very broken. Hi, Rabbi Andrea. Thank you so much for joining me on the show this week.
I'm very excited both to be here with you and also the topic. It's going to be great fun to talk about.
Yeah, I'm really excited. So I've been starting each episode by asking my guests to talk a little bit about their Jewish upbringing. Could you tell me about yours?
Sure. So my parents had very, very different upbringings, each of them when they grew up. So my dad was born at the end of World War II. He was actually born in a DP camp in Bergen-Belsen. And eventually they immigrated to the United States when my dad was still young, like 5 years old. So he pretty much grew up here in New York. But because of the experience that his parents had, my grandparents on that side, they were very Jewish, but they were very not religious. Like it was not of interest to them anymore. So like my dad doesn't know Hebrew. He was not immersed, let's just say that, in like Judaism growing up. But he grew up in Brooklyn. So he was immersed in the culture. My mom grew up in a modern Orthodox household in Cincinnati. And so she grew up in a kosher home. They changed dishes at Passover. She knew Hebrew. She knew the prayers. And they met at undergraduate at the University of Cincinnati and fell in love. And their compromise at the time was to be conservative. I attended a conservative Jewish synagogue, and we did keep kosher for a while when I was growing up. And we lived in Cincinnati for a while. So we saw my maternal grandparents, who were much more like ritually observant. Like we had Shabbat dinner there every Friday night, almost every Friday night, for all the time that I lived there until I was 7, when we had to move for my dad's job. And so once we were like on our own, we moved to St. Louis, and my parents actually didn't feel comfortable or at home at the conservative synagogues here, but they really loved the head rabbi at Sher Emeth. It was a Reform congregation. My mom freaked out because there was an organ that played at services at the time. Like that was very hard for her, but she loved the rabbi so much that they decided to make the switch. And so I grew up mostly in Reform congregations, but my life at home is a little more traditional than most Reform Jews at the time.
And do you remember when you were growing up, the first time that you saw a Jewish character in some kind of secular media, whether that was a book or a movie or a TV show?
So I don't know if this was the first time, but the very first thing I ever remember was there was the book fair in elementary school. And we had to preview the book fair before like we brought in money to buy it. And I was probably in 3rd grade, 2nd or 3rd grade. And at the preview, I picked up this book called Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, by Judy Blume, which I had never heard of Judy Blume before. And in my recollection, I think Margaret's parents one is Jewish and one is not, but they do talk about that in the book. And then because of that, I read a lot of Judy Blume, and the most Jewish book that I remember of hers was called Starring Sally J. Friedman as herself, where she is in Florida. I don't know if she's on vacation or she's with her family, but she thinks that Hitler is hiding out in Miami. She's like, it's very like her being Jewish is a big part of the book. And like,
I've never heard of that.
Yeah. I don't know if it holds up.
Yeah.
I was like, I wonder if I still have it, but I don't. I bet it's in the congregational library somewhere under.
Yeah. I'm going to have to go looking for that.
Yeah. But that's probably the first concrete memory I have. So yeah.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. I'm definitely going to have to go look for that. So I want to move on to this week's main topic, The Good Place. So Weirdly, you were one of the first people that I thought of when I started putting this episode together. And we've never talked about The Good Place before, but it's one of my favorite shows, and it's a show that a lot of rabbis like, right?
Yes, I think you are right about that. Sometimes you have to say to the rabbis, just stick with it for a couple of episodes, because I think in the beginning it feels a little silly. There's a lot of depth to that show, but I'm not sure in the first 2 episodes it's readily apparent. Like you just have to have a little bit of patience with it. But yes, many rabbis who I know love this show and try to create classes around it and want to pick out the best episodes, to show in confirmation and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was created by Mike Schur, who is Jewish, but he didn't want to base the show on any particular religion. He wanted to base it on ethics and sort of a general spirituality. So given that, we're told in the very first episode that this afterlife is not what any of the world's religions teach. So this is the setup, right? The very first episode. Eleanor, the main character, has just been told that she's dead and this is what's next. And the very first person she meets there, his name's Michael. He's there to answer any questions she has. So, of course, she wants to know who was right. And he tells her,
Hindus are a little bit right, Muslims a little bit, Jews, Christians, Buddhists. Every religion guessed about 5%, except for Doug Forsett.
And Doug Forsett was a stoner kid from Calgary who got really high on mushrooms one night in the 1970s and got 92% of it right. And I always thought that the inclusion of Jews in there was kind of funny because Jews don't actually have like a concrete idea of an afterlife. So I kind of wondered what the 5% was.
Correct. I think I'll say 2 things. The first is I think that a lot of modern Jews today, while they may not be practicing in terms of like their ritual practice in a very traditional way, I do think a lot of Jews feel connected to Judaism based on the ethical values that Judaism professes. So just using ethics as like the overall message of the show already, you're like, check, this is of interest. And secondly, you're right. So Judaism, unlike some other religions, Judaism is pretty honest about the fact that we actually don't know. Like nobody, to our knowledge, has come back. So we don't know for sure what happens to our souls, essentially, after we die. That doesn't stop the ancient rabbis and even people today from like positing, suggesting, supposing different ideas. But what makes Judaism different is that not one of those is the universal belief that all Jews must believe in. And in fact, nobody has to believe in any of it in order to be considered fully Jewish. It's just this why. It's like a large buffet of what might happen to us after we die. Yes, that's exactly right.
Mm-hmm. So with this original concept that starts out in season 1 with the standard point system, again, it's not totally Jewish, but some parts of it really feel like they are. I'm thinking especially of how intent factors into point value. For instance, there's a scene in season 3 when Michael explains that buying a tomato at a grocery store can be minus 12 points after you factor in everything like where the tomato comes from, where you buy it.
Who picked it?
Yeah. What you're going to use it for. And it just reminded me of Maimonides' ladder of tzedakah, which basically says that the favorability of a charitable action depends on your intent. So the top rung of the ladder, the most favorable way to give tzedakah or to do good, is to help someone else become self-sufficient. And then the next one down is to give anonymously and without knowing the recipient. Then the bottom rung is giving begrudgingly and less than what's actually needed. And you're still getting some credit for that too, whereas further up on the ladder, you're not doing it for the credit at all. So especially with Tahani, who did all of this good, but for the wrong reasons, I was really reminded of Maimonides' ladder.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. Like, I love that because I actually had not thought of that. But especially when you say intent, I remember reading an article, I think, about the show and like how, because people were like, how did you even think to do this? The story is so great that the creator said he was like online getting like a fancy coffee or something and cost however many dollars. And he like thinks of himself as a very good person and he's a generous person and he has means. So he's going to tip, the barista, which is not like that's an optional thing in the jar. And he goes to do it and she turns away, to like grab his muffin or start making the drink. And he noticed that his hand, he does not drop the money into the tip jar. He just holds his hand there until she turned back around And then he dropped it in. And then he took his stuff and sat down, and he became super reflective about that moment. He was like, why did I have to do that? Like, do I need credit for doing something good? Do we only do something good if we get the credit? Is it not good if you do an act of charity in the forest and nobody sees you? Does it not count? And when you talk about Maimonides' ladder of tzedakah, as you're describing it, you're right. So when I teach about it, I usually say the most important thing is just get on the ladder. Give. If you can give, even if you're grumpy about it, because it's better than nothing. But ideally, you want to be giving in a way that there's like this hierarchy, and toward the top, the very top, as you said, is helping someone to become self-sufficient. But at the first 4 rungs before that is all talking about who can know who did what, and that protecting the privacy of the person in need, right, is important. That's like the most important.
That's more important than the donor getting credit.
Yes, exactly. But eventually the second to top rung is that neither of them know, right? The giver doesn't know who she's giving to, and the recipient doesn't know who he's getting it from. And so the idea is that we do good for good's sake, for the sake of doing good. And I think in the show, that is a lot of what they are looking at in terms of the different models of ethics that they study and learn about. But I think the show is preaching, like, you want to get to the good place, but you want to do it, right? Like in the season when they realize that there's no hope.
Yeah, in season 3, after the whole Soul Squad has been brought back to life to get a second chance, something we're going to come back to later because this is all interconnected, they accidentally find out about the afterlife. And then there's basically this big paradox. Because if they know how it works, if they know that every one of their actions is going to earn or lose them points, their intention will always be to earn points. So now they can't get them anymore because they'll always have the wrong intentions. So at that point, then everything that they're doing is just for the sake of doing good. And that's exactly what Judaism teaches, because we don't have a heaven-hell concept. We're not doing good for some eventual prize. We only do good to put good out into the world, which I love.
That is spot on. And and I think ultimately, I don't think it's only a Jewish
message.
No.
I
think he was trying to take us there in some sneaky way. I just do think they parallel each other perfectly. And that is ultimately a really big part of what the characters learn, because they could just give up, right? They could have just gone, okay, if nothing matters, we may as well just sit here until we die. Right.
Or let's do every terrible thing because we're going to the bad place anyway.
But
instead they decide to take it and run with it and help as many people as they can. Like Tahani gives away huge amounts of money. I think all of her money.
Yeah.
And Jason and Eleanor try to help their friends and family get into the good place.
Yeah. They're like the top rung. Yeah.
I want to go back to something you said a minute ago about how these Jewish teachings, these Jewish influences aren't necessarily in your face 100% purposefully Jewish. I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's something I wanted to cover in this podcast overall. Like, I'm not trying to say that all of these Jewish creators spent hours in Torah study or something before they worked on their shows or their books or whatever content it is I'm talking about. Because like you said earlier, a lot of modern Jews may not be practicing ritually, but they connect to the cultural and ethical aspects, or they grew up practicing and they aren't anymore. And so I think that Jewish ethics tends to find its way into a lot of content because writers maybe aren't consciously thinking this is Jewish, this is what I learned at Hebrew school. Instead they're thinking this is good, this is my definition of good, so that's what they're putting into their work.
Yes, I think so too. I think Judaism in general, I think like the themes of Judaism and the ethical teachings in Judaism are very universal.
Yeah.
The ritual is very particularistic, right? Mm-hmm. It's hard if you're not Jewish and you walk into a synagogue and they're chanting Hebrew, like you do feel like like you don't understand. Never mind that half the Jews don't understand the Hebrew either, but it doesn't sound foreign, right, to the Jewish ear, or uncomfortable. So it's an interesting religion because the rituals that make it unique are super particularistic, but the ideas that Judaism espouse are very universal and are very embracing. And I learned very late, pretty late for me, one of the first prayers I learned as a kid was the Shema, which is pretty standard for lots of kids. Yeah. And at the time when I learned it, like the big lesson about that was like, God is one, Jews were the first monotheists, right? And you're like 5 years old. You're like, I don't even know what are you saying? Like, why is that important? There's nothing meaningful. But much, much, much later, I learned that the Shema is an important prayer because of the notion of echad, which means one, not one, only one God, like there could be 60, but like the idea of oneness. God can be understood as a oneness that embraces all of humanity, all of the created world, that is sort of this connecting force that runs through us. And that resonates with me personally. And I think opens the door for lots of people to be able to connect on levels of meaning and understanding.
Yeah, I love that interpretation of the Shema. So speaking of these sort of universal concepts, I want to talk about teshuvah and second chances. So eventually the Soul Squad realizes that something is very, very wrong with the point system, right? They find out that no human has gotten into the good place for about 500 years. Because if you can lose 12 points for buying a tomato from the grocery store, that's not right. So they're like, okay, we gotta fix this, or we gotta find someone who can fix this. So they go to the judge, who's the closest thing that the show has to God, because they didn't actually want to put God on the show, which I'd argue is another Jewish thing. We don't portray God visually. But anyway, the judge is played by the awesome and Jewish Maya Rudolph.
Love her.
And the Soul Squad convinces her that humans need a second chance. And that wasn't really a sudden realization. The main characters have been getting second chances since the beginning. The original concept of both the show and the fake good place was that Chidi would give Eleanor ethics lessons, but he actually did teach her to be good. And that ended up happening over and over again. And he eventually taught Jason and finally even Tahani and Michael to be better people. And along the way, Chidi learned how to be a better person himself. So they all got these second chances in the afterlife. They all became better people. But with the way the point system worked originally, it didn't help them at all. Because the beings that created the afterlife were like, well, you got your time on Earth and that's it. Nothing after that counts. But since they did get better, they wanted to give everyone else that same chance. Again, that's that top rung on Maimonides' ladder. And this concept of redemption, of second chances, it's also an important concept in Judaism, right? We do this during the high holidays. And it's a way of cleansing our souls in the same way that the Soul Squad is doing in the show. But there's also this dark part of it that we don't really see talked about as much in Judaism. And in this reinvention of the afterlife that they eventually create in the good place, it's not a quick transition from everyone was going to the bad place to everyone is getting into the good place. You actually have to spend time learning to be better. So Tahani and Camilla's parents have to fix their favoritism and their selfishness. Brent kind of has to fix his everything. But everyone has to spend some time in what used to be the bad place. They have to fix their flaws. They have to learn to fix them. And that's sort of reminiscent of, and please correct my pronunciation here, Gehinnom.
Yeah, no, that was perfect.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a purgatory, although that's more of a Christian term. But it's where souls go when they're not quite ready for the afterlife yet. Or they can go to be cleansed, right, in Judaism.
Yeah. I'll say two things. Right. Yes, that's a really good parallel. We don't talk about it as much in Judaism, and there's no discussion about really what happens there. I always think of it as like a spiritual car wash. Like you're not necessarily doing the work. And some people believe in it, and some people are like, I don't know. But the process of teshuvah that you talked about, that parallels this perfectly. Like for Jews, that's the point of what we're doing while we are here. So I'll say a couple of things. Number one, teshuvah is only been fully completed when you come upon the exact same situation where you messed up, right?
Yeah.
Where you make the wrong choice and you choose correctly. You choose the good. So that's exactly their system of training people, right? They put them in these challenging circumstances that are challenging for them. My challenge isn't the same as your challenge. And they try over time to refine them. So eventually they understand how you say to be better. The second piece is this theme is huge at the High Holy Days, for sure. It is my absolute favorite thing about being Jewish. Nobody is beyond redemption. Mm-hmm. Nobody. Like everybody can always have a chance to get better. Although in Judaism, we say, while we're here. There is a certain belief, the mystics do believe in reincarnation, and that they feel is for the same purpose. So the mystic Jews do believe we get reincarnated to go through this again and again. But if we just take our lifespan, the idea is that we are trying to get better. And interestingly, if you're a Jew who prays every day, in the daily prayer book, not in the Shabbat prayers. So for those of us who only come on Shabbat, we don't hear it. But if you pray daily in the daily minyan, there's a prayer for teshuvah every single day in the daily prayers for improvement. Because you're not doing this once a year. You're real, like if it's going to work, you got to like practice it every day throughout the year. And Judaism has 4 New Years. There's like the spiritual New Year at Rosh Hashanah. There's the New Year for the trees. There's the New Year beginning the monthly cycles. And there's a New Year for animals. Okay, none of it really matters, except to say, in my opinion, like that's a religion that believes in the possibility of beginning again, that no one's story is ever fully written, that you always can. Teshuvah, it means to return or turn, right? You can always turn to a better way. And the other thing I really love about the show is I think they stress not only the learning aspect, but they really stress that they can't do this alone.
Yes. None of the characters are capable of doing anything that they do on their own. Anything at any point. They all have to work together.
Yeah. And I also think that's very Jewish, right? Like change requires community. Define that as you may, but that the idea of a minyan in Judaism, that you can't really mourn the people that you have lost unless there are 9 other people with you, because you shouldn't be alone to do hard things. You should have the support of other people, and you're a help to someone else. Where someone else is stumbling, you can be that help. And I think those are all very Jewish themes and ideas. Yeah.
So another thing that I always felt was very Jewish about The Good Place is that the characters are always questioning everything.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
We're going to go into this a lot more in depth next time with Good Omens, but I think something that a lot of people who aren't Jewish or just who only have experience with other organized religions, something they don't really understand is that we don't really accept things as is. We always ask a million questions about everything. And the characters in the show do that too. They never just take things at face value. And that just always felt intrinsically Jewish to me.
Yes, I did. Again, I didn't think of that until you just said it. That's amazing. But I agree with you. There's always like more to the story. And yeah. Oh, I love that. That's great, Allie. That's great. Yeah, I agree.
And before we wrap up, Rabbi Andrea, who's your favorite character from the show?
Oh, it is funny you ask that. My 15-year-old daughter loves Jason.
Shocking.
I know. She thinks he is the best. And I do love Chidi a lot.
Yeah, that's who I was expecting
but
you to
honestly,
say.
I think my favorite character, honestly, is Michael. I just think I like Michael in some ways the most because of something that Janet says about humanity, I think. Like one of the episodes, I think it's when Chidi has to like get rebooted and Eleanor doesn't, and she's so sad.
Yeah.
And Janet is trying to say, but like the beauty of being human is that we just don't know. And that Michael wants that so badly. I think as humans, we fight against that a lot. Like we want to know, like we want certainty and we want to know, and we forget to take delight in possibility. And sometimes because what we don't know, it can be scary. So it is hard, but lots of times it can be better than we ever imagined. We can learn something about ourselves and the world and someone else. And his just sheer delight in that is aspirational for me. And so I'm going with Michael.
Okay. Okay, I know I said I was going to wrap up, but you actually just reminded me of one more thing. So on the last episode, I spoke with Rabbi Lori, and we were talking about how the last book of the Torah is very open-ended, how we don't know what comes next.
Yeah.
And that kind of reminds me of the show's finale. We sort of get a glimpse. It's implied, but it's a really beautiful sort of parallel, that open-endedness.
Yes. I agree. I thought it was a beautiful, I'm telling you, that last episode I thought was one of the most beautiful moments, like the whole episode. I thought was one of the most perfect episodes of television I had ever watched.
Yeah.
I loved it. Yeah.
It has to be one of the best finales of all time.
Right. Because it is hard to end something. And I just thought they did it. How could I ask for it to be better? It was wonderful. It was so wonderful.
Yeah. I know there's so much more to talk about with The Good Place, but this was a fantastic conversation. Rabbi Andrea, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks, Allie. It was great.
Thanks for listening. Join me next time where I'll be speaking with Abby Hansel-Baumgarten about Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett's Good Omens. If you're enjoying the first season of They Made It Out of Clay, leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Also, give us a follow on Instagram and Facebook at Out of Clay Pod to learn more about Jewish pop culture history, listen to bonus content, and be the first to know when a new episode drops. Lahitz Roat!